I never imagined I'd be recounting this, but the events of January 7th, 2024 changed everything. I'm Matthew Carter from Washington, a regular guy, a husband, a father, and a hard-working man. I never thought that day would be my last, yet it was. For exactly 11 minutes and 46 seconds, I was clinically dead, and in that state, I felt more alive than ever. What I experienced beyond this world left me shaken. Jesus revealed future events to me, especially those set for March 2025, and I can't keep these revelations to myself. You need to hear this. It was a cold winter evening in Washington after a grueling day at work. My job was nothing extraordinary, a typical 9-to-5 office role. But that day I was more exhausted than usual. Rain had begun in the afternoon, and by the time I climbed into my car, the roads were slick. I called my wife, Rachel, and she reminded me to pick up some milk on the way home. I promised her I'd stop at the corner store near our house. It seemed like just another normal day. I had no idea it would be the final conversation I'd share with her before I died. Driving along Interstate 5, I kept the radio on, flipping through stations. The rain pounded harder, and the windshield wipers struggled to keep up. I wasn't speeding, just cruising at 35 miles per hour. But visibility quickly deteriorated. Then, without warning, a sudden flash of headlights blinded me. A truck, wildly out of control, was careening straight toward me. I had no time to react or think. My body tensed, and then everything went black. The next moment I found myself floating, detached from my physical form. At first there was no pain, no chill, just a profound emptiness. I had lost all awareness of my body, merely existing in a state of suspension, with my mind unusually clear. Yet something felt off. I couldn't sense the weight of my body anymore. Glancing downward, I saw the accident scene unfolding. My Honda Civic lay mangled, steam rising from its crushed hood while the truck driver had leaped out, pacing in shock. Soon, paramedics arrived and pulled my lifeless body from the wreck. It was eerie watching them try to revive me, their frantic efforts to restart my heart. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. Instead, I felt a profound peace, unlike anything I'd ever known. The blare of sirens and the shouts of the rescue team seemed distant, as if I were watching a silent movie. Then, I sensed something behind me. A tugging force pulled at me. I turned, and there it was. A tunnel, not a dark, endless void, but a passage of golden light, vibrant and in motion, as if it possessed a mind of its own. The instant I saw it, I knew it was not a natural phenomenon. I realized it was a gateway to something beyond human comprehension, beckoning me forward. As soon as I stepped toward it, everything around me began to fade. The sounds of the paramedics, the wreckage, the rain, even the city of Washington dissolved into nothingness. In that moment, the tunnel was all that existed. It wasn't just light. It was alive. It pulsed, radiated warmth, and embraced me like a loving hug. I felt an irresistible pull drawing me in, and then I noticed a figure standing at the far end. At first, his face was hidden by the overwhelming glow, but deep within, I recognized him. My soul identified him before my mind could comprehend. Jesus. The realization sent tremors through my entire being, and those tremors came not from fear, but from overwhelming awe and love. He was more than just a figure. He embodied everything. He was love, truth, and power all at once. His voice resonated, not as a sound in my ears, but as an inner whisper that spoke directly to my soul. Matthew, it said, calling me by name as if he'd known me my whole life. As though he had been waiting for me, Jesus extended his hand. The moment his touch reached me, my entire reality shifted. The tunnel vanished, and suddenly I found myself standing on a city street that resembled Washington, but it wasn't Washington at all. It looked familiar, yet there was an unmistakable difference. The buildings were sleek and modern. Still, something felt off. People strolled along, going about their day, but their expressions were strangely vacant. They moved mechanically, absorbed in their own worlds and disconnected from one another. "Watch closely," Jesus urged, in a tone that was both gentle and firm. I scanned my surroundings. I saw a woman enter a coffee shop. Instead of using cash or a card, she waved her hand over a scanner. A faint light flashed beneath her skin. A technology that appeared harmless, convenient, even normal. But then Jesus spoke words that sent chills down my spine. "This is only the beginning of a deception you cannot yet comprehend." At first, it seemed merely advanced technology. But then the scene shifted. People began to accept this new system willingly. It started with payments, then identification, and eventually it touched every aspect of life. Jesus turned to me, his eyes brimming with sorrow. "This is how it all begins," he said. As I watched, an intense unease settled over me. I wanted to shout a warning, but no one could hear me. Then Jesus revealed an even darker vision. March 2025. What I saw next made my blood run cold. Standing beside Jesus, the scene transformed. The city vanished. In its place, I found myself in an enormous conference room filled with screens showing world leaders, scientists, and public figures making an announcement. One screen displayed the date. March 2025. A man stepped forward. I didn't recognize his face, but his presence and confidence commanded trust. With a smile, he declared, "We have discovered the ultimate solution for security, health, and prosperity. This is the future." Behind him, the screen showed images of a new system, a small implanted device, resembling a tiny glowing mark just beneath the skin. At first, it appeared innocuous, promising convenience, safety, and economic stability. Yet I sensed something was profoundly wrong. Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "This is the moment of deception. They will never see it for what it truly is." The announcement was met with thunderous applause, and the world embraced it eagerly. But then Jesus showed me more. I suddenly saw people lining up to receive this mark. There was no coercion or threat, just raw desperation. Without it, they couldn't buy food, access their bank accounts, or even obtain medical care. I watched a man struggle to resist, clinging to his faith while his wife and children starved, and his employer refused to let him work without the mark. I witnessed the precise moment he yielded, and as he accepted it, I sensed a darkness seep into his soul. There were no dramatic outbursts or possessions, yet something had irrevocably changed. Jesus then met my eyes, his expression filled with grief. "They won't even realize what they have lost," he murmured. Next, I saw how it all began, how the deception wasn't a sudden twist, but unfolded gradually. It developed step by step, so slowly that no one noticed at first. It began with small conveniences, devices implanted for simple payments. These smart systems, designed to simplify life, soon became essential for work, travel, and healthcare. Even churches adopted them. I heard pastors telling their congregations, "This isn't the mark of the beast, it's just technology. God understands." And people believed them. Jesus shook his head. "Even my own people will be deceived." I saw how social pressure was wielded. Those who resisted were mocked and labeled as conspiracy theorists, extremists, or relics of the past. Some churches remained true, warning their congregations, but many succumbed. They didn't see the danger because it wasn't forced upon them. It was welcomed. Jesus looked at me with deep sorrow. The greatest deception is one that doesn't appear to be a deception at all. Then I witnessed something even more terrifying. A monumental crisis unfolded, a series of massive natural disasters, economic collapses, and violent conflicts that gripped the world in fear. Out of the chaos, a leader emerged, promising peace, stability, and unity. He wasn't a dictator or tyrant. Charismatic, articulate, and logical, he offered answers that people found irresistible. Under his leadership, a new global system was introduced, a system touted as the way to prevent war, hunger, and financial instability. I saw how willingly people embraced him. They hailed him as a genius and peacemaker, and nations submitted without resistance. Yet Jesus spoke with urgency. This is how control begins. He would not come with brute force, but with solutions that initially seemed harmless. Then the rules changed. Those who resisted the system began to vanish. Some were arrested for spreading misinformation, while others lost their homes as their bank accounts were frozen overnight. Churches that defied the system were shut down, and dissenters were labeled threats to progress. The world was seduced by a false peace, and Jesus whispered, "This is the trap." Then he showed me something even deeper. I began to see what was happening in the spiritual realm behind all of this. I witnessed waves of darkness sweeping over cities, unnoticed by their inhabitants. People who walked as if nothing were wrong. Yet, on a spiritual level, they were transforming. The technology wasn't only physical, it was seeping into their minds and souls. I saw prayers growing feeble, pastors losing their passion, and worship services turning into empty performances rather than heartfelt encounters with God. And the worst part, they didn't even realize it was happening. Jesus pointed to a family in their home, already fitted with the new system. To the outside world, their lives appeared perfect, no illness, no financial woes. But I could see what they couldn't. Their spirits were dimmed, their hearts hardened. They still talked about God, still attended church, yet their connection had vanished. Jesus then said, "The enemy doesn't need to strip away their faith entirely, only to weaken it slowly until my voice can no longer be heard." I realized that the enemy's plan was never to force people into outright evil. It was to make them so comfortable, so numb, that they no longer needed God at all. That's when I understood the truth. This wasn't merely a struggle for control. It was a battle for souls. The next vision Jesus showed me was even more personal and agonizing. I saw families, husbands, wives, and children torn apart not by war or disease, but by an insidious force of deception and division. It started in a small way. I saw a father at the dinner table, absorbed in scrolling on his digital wrist interface, while his children excitedly tried to share something with him, but he barely noticed. His mind was completely plugged in, perpetually distracted, while his wife sat across from him, visibly worried, as if pleading, "Can't you see what's happening? We're losing ourselves." But he just laughed it off, saying, "Come on, it's just technology. It makes life easier." "Why are you always so paranoid?" she snapped. Then Jesus told me, "This will be the enemy's greatest weapon, convincing people that their chains are really freedom." At that moment, I saw a mother desperately pleading with her teenage son. He had just received his first digital upgrade, and she could already sense something was off. His responses were shallow, distant, almost robotic, no longer the boy who once prayed with her at bedtime. "Please, don't go any further with this. You don't need it," she pleaded, but he simply sighed and rolled his eyes. "Mom, this is the future. Everyone is doing it. You're the one stuck in the past," he retorted. She tried to hold him close, but he pulled away. The vision shifted, and I saw churches beginning to divide. Half the congregation embraced the new system as progress, while the other half resisted, warning it would lead to spiritual blindness. Those who resisted were mocked, ostracized, and even labeled as troublemakers. I witnessed people turning in their own family members for refusing to comply. I saw a woman sobbing as her husband declared, "I can't stay with you if you won't get it." Her eyes filled with pain as she whispered back, "I'd rather lose you than lose my soul." Jesus then spoke with a heavy heart. "Many will face this choice, and many will choose wrongly. Then Jesus revealed something that made my blood run cold. The mark was nothing like people expected. There was no overt violence, no physical coercion. At first, it was just a tool, a means to replace passwords, enhance security, and track health. But over time, it became so much more. I saw a man trying to buy groceries. He reached for his wallet, but the cashier shook her head and said, "You need to upgrade." As he looked around, he noticed everyone else was simply waving their hand over a scanner, their digital marks faintly glowing. They smiled and chatted, completely oblivious to what they had sacrificed. But when he refused, the atmosphere turned cold. People stared at him like he was an outsider, an intruder in their perfect world. I saw others lose their homes, their jobs, basically their very ability to belong in society, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because they chose not to comply. Jesus looked at me with profound sorrow. This is how the enemy operates, not by force, but through exclusion. Then I witnessed something even more disturbing. The mark wasn't only physical, it had a spiritual dimension. I saw people with the mark trying to pray. They still attended church and called on God, yet their prayers felt empty, their worship hollow, as though a veil blocked them from truly reaching Him. Jesus whispered, "They won't even know what they've lost." The vision then shifted to a small group of individuals who were unmistakably different. They bore no mark and did not belong to the system. They were hidden away, gathering in secret to pray. Though few in number, their faith burned like an unquenchable flame. I saw a young girl, no older than 10, praying with a power I had never witnessed. She had no access to the digital world, yet she possessed something infinitely stronger, the Holy Spirit. Jesus pointed to them and said, "These are my true followers." They had no earthly securities, no homes, no jobs. Some even lived in the wilderness, moving from place to place, yet they enjoyed a peace that defied the magnitude of their losses. Then, miracles began to unfold before my eyes. I watched as a man raised his hands in prayer, and food materialized before him. A woman with a sick child who couldn't reach a doctor touched him and saw him healed instantly. Though cut off from the world, they were connected to something far greater. Jesus turned to me and said, "The world may call them weak, but in my kingdom, they are the strongest." After that, he showed me something even more astonishing. The world had turned against these faithful ones. Laws were enacted that targeted them. They could no longer buy, sell, or even move freely. Yet, inexplicably, they remained untouched. I saw a group of believers surrounded by armed men. These soldiers had found, reported, and tracked them down, but as they raised their weapons, the guns jammed. The soldiers exchanged bewildered glances before turning and fleeing, while angels stood guard among the believers. I then saw a man walking through the city, completely invisible to the scanning cameras that sought unmarked individuals. The system simply couldn't detect him. Jesus proclaimed, "I will protect my own in ways the world cannot fathom." Shortly after, I witnessed food multiplying. Even when supplies were meager, it never ran out. The people were continuously sustained. I saw a storm approaching, a disaster wreaking havoc on a city, but in the areas where the faithful resided, the storm abruptly halted, as if an invisible shield had been erected around them. Then Jesus spoke words that shook me to my core. "The enemy will come with power, but my power is greater. Tell them not to be afraid." His expression was both solemn and urgent as he continued, "Tell them to prepare now, before the choice is taken from them." I saw people scrambling in those final moments, desperately trying to resist, even as it was too late. They had brushed aside the warnings, convinced they had plenty of time. But when the decisive moment arrived, they weren't ready. Panic overtook them, and they surrendered. I witnessed believers, once fierce in their faith, gradually compromising until they could no longer tell truth from falsehood. The deception crept in so slowly, they hardly noticed the drift. Then Jesus revealed another group to me, those who had prepared long before the world began to change. These people weren't merely physically ready. They were spiritually rooted. They had built a faith so strong and unyielding that when the moment came, they stood firm. Tell them to deepen their relationship with me now, Jesus said. They must know my voice so well that nothing can mislead them. I saw them poring over their Bibles every day, not out of mere habit, but as if it were their lifeline. They didn't simply attend church, they lived in prayer, always seeking God's guidance. They taught their children to love Jesus more than anything in the world. I watched families make tough choices early, forgoing certain comforts and stepping away from the system while there was still time. Others formed tight-knit communities, supporting one another because they knew they'd need each other when the world turned hostile. Then Jesus spoke words that sent shivers down my spine. Many will wait until it's too late. They will cry out for help, but by then they will have chosen another master. I felt an urgency like never before, knowing our time to prepare was nearly gone. When Jesus looked at me, I saw, for the first time, a deep sorrow in his eyes, not born of weakness but from knowing so many would refuse to listen. I have given them everything, he said. I have warned them through my word, through my prophets, and through my spirit. Yet many still refuse to see. Then he placed his hand on my shoulder and uttered words I'll never forget. The coming days will be the toughest mankind has ever faced, but my people need not fear. I will guide and protect them. They must choose now whom they will serve. I saw his profound love, a love for every soul, even for those who would turn away. There was no anger in his tone, only sorrow for the lost. Then he added one final message. Tell them not to fear. The enemy may hold sway over this world, but he doesn't control eternity. Those who remain faithful to me will reign with me in the kingdom to come. And just like that, he was gone. The next moment, I found myself gasping for air. The hospital room spun around me as the relentless beeping of monitors filled my ears. I had returned. A nurse hurried over, shaking her head. You were dead for nearly 12 minutes. It's a miracle you're back. But I wasn't thinking about the miracle. My mind was consumed with what I had seen. I stared at my hands, my body, my surroundings. It all felt surreal. I had been with Jesus, and now I was back in this fragile, broken world. For days, I wrestled with how to share my experience. Who would believe me? I confided in a close friend, but he just laughed it off, claiming it was nothing more than oxygen-deprived hallucinations. Even my wife hesitated. She recognized the conviction in my voice, but didn't know how to respond. That's when I remembered Jesus' words. Do not worry about who listens. Your task is to share. So, here I am sharing this with you, not seeking attention or validation, but because Jesus instructed me to do so. March 2025 is approaching, and the world is changing exactly as he showed me. If you're reading this, don't wait until it's too late. Prepare your heart, strengthen your faith, and teach your children. Stay close to Jesus, because the deception is coming, and most won't even notice. What struck me most was how quietly and subtly it would all occur. The enemy wouldn't force his way in or announce his arrival with terror or destruction. Instead, he'd infiltrate hearts through comfort, convenience, and gradual compromise. I saw people accepting these changes without question. At first, it was small innovations, new technologies, upgrades in everyday life, and artificial intelligence promising better decisions, marketed as ways to improve lives, reduce stress, and ease struggles. I even saw churches embracing these advances, with pastors using them to track attendance, organize worship, and enhance Bible study with personalized spiritual guidance. But amid the shift, no one noticed the subtle control over emotions that began. I saw a young man in his early 20s, once passionately devoted to Christ, whose zeal dimmed after receiving an upgrade. His prayers became infrequent, his hunger for God's word faded, not because he'd lost his belief, but because the urgency had disappeared. I also witnessed a woman plagued by anxiety, whose emotions were tamed by the new system, keeping her in a constant neutral state. Yet it also numbed her conscience. She no longer felt conviction over sin and stopped repenting. Jesus turned to me and said, "This is the enemy's method, not by taking away their faith, but by making them so comfortable that they no longer need me." I wept as I saw people lose their spiritual discernment without even realizing it. They still went to church, still prayed, but their connection to God eroded bit by bit until one day they simply stopped caring. Then, when the final step came, a demand for total allegiance to the system, they offered no resistance. At that moment, Jesus showed me a world-changing event that sent chills down my spine. I saw chaos unfolding, nations trembling, people crying out in desperation, and an air so heavy with fear it was almost tangible. Something monumental had occurred, a shock that shook the very foundation of society. Governments scrambled to respond. Leaders held emergency meetings with faces etched in urgency. World economies collapsed overnight, and bank accounts were suddenly frozen. Businesses shuttered, and a message echoed across every screen. "A solution is coming," Jesus whispered. "This will be the final push." In their desperation, people turned to the new system without question. They were too afraid. Religious leaders appeared on television, respected and trusted, speaking calmly. This is not the mark of the beast. It's merely a way to rebuild after the crisis. God wants us to be wise and take part. As a result, churches split. Some followed blindly, trusting the voices they'd always heard, while others who recognized the truth were labeled extremists or troublemakers. I saw one faithful man pleading with his family, "Please, don't do this. This is what Jesus warned us about." But his own brother laughed, dismissing him as paranoid. "If you don't want to eat, that's your choice," he said. And despite the man's desperate pleas, his family had already made up their minds. The deception was complete. Jesus spoke again. "Only those deeply rooted in me will see the truth. Everyone else will be led astray by lies." Then the vision shifted, and I saw a beacon of light in the darkness. Across the world, small groups remained steadfast. They had refused to join the system, and in doing so, lost everything: homes, jobs, even family ties. But they never lost their faith. They gathered in secret, in homes, forests, abandoned spaces, without modern technology or access to the new system, yet they possessed something far more powerful. I saw them praying with an intensity I'd never witnessed, their worship raw, pure, and alive. Miracles occurred among them. Food appeared where there was none, the sick were healed instantly, and they became invisible to tracking systems. As they passed security scanners, nothing detected them. I saw a woman with her children who had gone days without food. She prayed over an empty bowl, and within moments it overflowed with bread. Jesus said, "Just as I provided for my people in the wilderness, I will provide for you again." I witnessed angels walking among them, seemingly ordinary figures until they halted soldiers in their tracks. The soldiers, sent to arrest the believers, were forced to retreat, as if their mission had been forgotten. God was protecting his people in ways beyond human understanding. Then Jesus declared, "This is why you must not fear. The world may reject you, but I will never forsake you." I saw the believers growing stronger, even as the world crumbled around them. And then he said one final thing, Soon I will return, and those who endure will reign with me. Then everything faded to black. Jesus looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with urgency and sorrow. I could feel the weight of what was coming, not only in the world, but in the spiritual realm. This is the final call, he said. Many still slumber, thinking they have more time, but soon the door will close. At that moment I saw a vast door in the sky, massive and made of light, slowly closing. It wasn't slammed shut, but crept closed, offering a little time, though not much. I saw people sprinting toward it in desperate hope, some pounding on it and pleading for entry, while others lingered just outside, hesitant to step forward. They had heard the warnings yet chose to ignore them. Some even laughed at those who rushed in, calling them paranoid. But as they mocked, the door closed completely, leaving those outside in pure horror. They banged their fists, screamed and cried, but the door remained shut. Jesus whispered, "Just as in the days of Noah." I gasped. This was it, the final moment before everything changed. Jesus then pointed to a clock floating in the air, its countdown ticking away, barely any time left. I saw people going about their lives, oblivious to the ticking clock. They laughed, worked, and scrolled through their devices as if nothing were amiss, until suddenly the clock stopped, and everything shifted. The world around me darkened, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing what lay hidden beneath the surface. Demons roaming freely, influencing everything from the media to world leaders, even infiltrating churches. No one could see them, for they had already surrendered their faith for comfort and their discernment for convenience. And then I heard it, a final trumpet blast. I saw two groups of people. The first were those who had prepared, who had resisted the system and remained faithful to Jesus. As the world crumbled, they stood untouched, fearless, for they had already surrendered everything to Christ. The second group were those who waited too long, assuming they'd have another chance, only to realize it was too late. They screamed and begged for mercy, but the moment of decision had passed. Jesus looked at me, his voice heavy. There will come a time when the choice is permanent, when those who are mine will be sealed in my protection, and those who have chosen the world will no longer hear my voice.